The morning sun glinted off my SBD Dauntless's wings as I pulled back on the stick, climbing through 20,000 feet above the Pacific. Below me, somewhere in that endless expanse of blue, lay 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. My radioman gunner, aviation radioman 2nd Class John Snowden, sat behind me, his twin. 30 caliber machine guns loaded and ready. Neither of us spoke. We both knew that in the next few minutes, one of us might die. It was 0900 hours, June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway was about to begin, and I was diving straight into the heart of Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. 6 months earlier, I'd been Lieutenant Junior Grade Norman Jack Kleiss, fresh out of flight training and assigned to Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the USS Enterprise. We'd been at sea on December 7th when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, a stroke of luck that kept our carrier from being caught like sitting ducks alongside Battleship Row. When we finally made it back to Pearl on December 8th, the harbor was still burning. The sight of those capsized battleships and the smell of burning oil and death, it's something that never leaves you. The nickname Dusty came from an unauthorized landing I'd made at Marine Corps Air Station U back in May 1941. Captain Murray, our squadron commander, wasn't too pleased about my freelancing, but the name stuck. In the Navy, once you get tagged with a handle like that, it's yours for life. From Pearl Harbor through the spring of 1942, we'd been hitting back wherever we could. The Marshalls, Wake Island, Marcus Island, carrier raids that were more about showing the flag than doing serious damage. But they taught us how to fight, how to work as a team. Most importantly, they taught us about our airplane. The Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless wasn't much to look at, a stubby, angular dive bomber with fixed landing gear and a 2-man crew. But she could take punishment and dish it out. Ed Hindman had designed her to do one thing perfectly: dive straight down at a target and put a bomb exactly where it needed to go. The SBD could haul a 1,000-pound bomb under her belly and 2 100-pound bombs under her wings, and she could dive at angles that would tear other aircraft apart. By June 1942, I'd logged over 300 hours in the SBD and made countless practice dives in the waters around Hawaii. We'd practice navigation, gunnery, and dive bombing until we could do it blindfolded. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, our air group commander, was a perfectionist who demanded precision in everything we did. Gentlemen, he'd tell us, when you're diving at 70 degrees in a 250-knot dive, you get one chance to get it right. Make it count. The intelligence briefings in late May had been different, more serious, more urgent. Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz intelligence officer, had been tracking Japanese radio traffic for weeks. Thanks to our codebreakers, we knew something big was coming. The Japanese were planning a major operation, codenamed Me, and the target was Midway Atoll. Midway was just a speck in the Pacific, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. 2 tiny islands surrounded by a coral reef, with an airstrip and a handful of buildings. But its location made it priceless. From Midway, Japanese bombers could reach Pearl Harbor. More importantly, Admiral Yamamoto was using Midway as bait to draw out the U.S. Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. He was bringing every major ship in the Imperial Navy, 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. It was the largest naval force ever assembled. What Yamamoto didn't know was that we were ready for him. On May 28, 1942, Task Force 16 sortied from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Halsey had come down with a skin condition, so Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had taken command. Spruance was a quiet, methodical officer, nothing like the flamboyant Halsey, but he had a reputation for sound judgment. Our task force centered on Enterprise and Hornet, with 6 cruisers and 9 destroyers providing escort. Task Force 17, built around the damaged carrier Yorktown, was racing to join us. Yorktown had been badly mauled at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 3 weeks earlier, but the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard had performed miracles, patching her up in just 3 days. She still had construction workers aboard when she sailed. The weather during our transit was typical for the North Pacific in early summer: overcast skies, choppy seas, and a stiff wind out of the northwest. We maintained radio silence, running dark to avoid Japanese submarines. The only sounds were the steady thrum of the Enterprise's engines and the crash of waves against her hull. On June 2nd, we rendezvoused with Task Force 17 approximately 300 miles northeast of Midway. It was an impressive sight: 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers spread across miles of ocean. But we were still outnumbered nearly 3-1 by the approaching Japanese fleet. That evening, Admiral Spruance called his squadron commanders together for the final briefing. I wasn't in that meeting, but word filtered down quickly. The Japanese were coming with everything they had: 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying over 270 aircraft. These weren't just any carriers. They were the same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean. Our intelligence indicated the Japanese would launch their first strike against Midway at dawn on June 4th. While their planes were attacking the atoll, our carriers would close from the northeast and hit them when they were most vulnerable, with their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. It was a desperate plan. We had 233 aircraft to their 270, and many of our planes were inferior to their Zeros and Vals. Our torpedo bombers were woefully obsolete, and our fighter escort would be spread thin. But we had one crucial advantage: we knew they were coming. I was awakened at 0300 hours by the bosun's pipe. Flight quarters, flight quarters. All pilots report to ready rooms. The Enterprise was already turning into the wind, her flight deck busy with pre-flight preparations. In Ready Room 6, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey briefed us on the morning's mission. A PBY Catalina had already spotted the Japanese fleet approximately 200 miles southwest of Midway, bearing 320 degrees, speed 24 knots. 4 carriers in a box formation with strong cruiser and destroyer screens. The enemy was exactly where our intelligence had predicted. At 0452 hours, radar operators on Midway detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 108 planes heading straight for the atoll. The Marines on Midway launched everything they had: obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of Wildcats, but they were swamped by Zeros. The Japanese strike hit Midway at 0630 hours, setting fuel tanks ablaze and cratering the airstrip. But the attack on Midway was just the opening move. While Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga's planes were bombing the island, Admiral Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. The Midway strike had been only partially successful. The airstrip was still operational. Tomonaga was radioing that a second strike was needed. Meanwhile, Nagumo's search planes had failed to locate any American ships. Unknown to Nagumo, the American carriers were racing toward him at flank speed. At 0700 hours, Enterprise launched her strike group. 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting 6 and Bombing 6, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo 6, and 10 F4F Wildcat fighters for escort. I was flying SBD Bureau number 6S6, with Snowden manning the rear guns. My plane carried a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb and 2 100-pound bombs, enough to gut a carrier if I could put them where they counted. Hornet launched her strike at 0758 hours, followed by Yorktown at 0906. In total, we were sending 151 aircraft against the Japanese fleet. It sounds impressive until you realize we were attacking the most heavily defended naval formation in the world. The flight to the Japanese fleet should have taken about 2 hours, but finding 4 carriers in 64 million square miles of ocean isn't easy, especially when they're maneuvering at high speed. McCluskey led our formation southwest, following the bearing reported by the PBY, but after an hour and a half of flying, we saw nothing but empty ocean. The Japanese had changed course. Behind us, Hornet's dive bombers had turned too far south and would never find the enemy. Her torpedo squadron ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, would survive. Yorktown's aircraft were still en route, but their torpedo squadron would be slaughtered by Zeros with no effective fighter cover. At 0955 hours, McCluskey made the decision that won the Battle of Midway. Instead of turning back, he continued southwest. Fuel was running low. We'd already passed the point where we were guaranteed to make it home, but McCluskey had spotted something, a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, throwing up a tall white wake. It was the destroyer Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. She was heading straight back to Nagumo's carriers like a compass needle pointing true north. We followed her wake. At 10:22 hours, Snowden's voice crackled over the intercom. "Skipper, I see them. Dead ahead, maybe 30 miles. There they were, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a rough box formation, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Even from 30 miles away, I could see aircraft spotted on their flight decks. They were preparing to launch another strike, probably at our carriers. But something was wrong with the picture. The Japanese were supposed to have a massive combat air patrol of Zeros circling overhead. Where were their fighters? The answer was tragic and simple. They were down low, having just finished slaughtering our torpedo bombers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet had been wiped out, 15 TBDs shot down with only Ensign Gay surviving. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise had lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo 3 from Yorktown would lose 12 of 13 planes. But those brave torpedo bomber crews had not died in vain. Their attacks, pressed home with suicidal courage, had drawn every Zero down to sea level. The Japanese combat air patrol was scattered, low on ammunition, and completely out of position when our dive bombers arrived at 20,000 feet. McCluskey didn't hesitate. At 10:25 hours, he rolled over into his attack dive on the carrier Kaga. Attack. 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 What happened next lasted only 5 minutes, but it changed the course of World War II. I was part of the second section, assigned to attack whichever carrier looked most lucrative. As McCluskey's section dove on Kaga, I spotted another flat top about 5 miles to the northwest. She was big, over 800 feet long, with a distinctive forward island structure. This was Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. But as I rolled into my dive, I noticed Lieutenant Best's section from Bombing 6 was already attacking Akagi. 2 sections hitting one carrier would be a waste. I pulled out of my dive and looked around for a better target. There, about 8 miles northeast of Akagi, was another carrier, this one smaller, but packed with aircraft. Intelligence had briefed us on Japanese carrier recognition, and I recognized the distinctive profile immediately. Soryu, one of the fast fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. "Snowden, we're going after that carrier to the east," I called over the intercom. "Roger, Skipper. I've got your back." I rolled the SBD over into a 70-degree dive. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000. The carrier grew larger in my bomb sight, her flight deck packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. I could see tiny figures running across the deck, crew members trying to get their planes airborne. At 10,000 feet, black puffs of anti-aircraft fire began bursting around my aircraft. The Japanese were throwing up everything they had, 5-inch guns from the destroyers, 25 millimeters, and 13 millimeters machine guns from the carrier itself. A shell burst close enough to rock the SBD, and I heard Snowden's guns chattering behind me as he fired at something, probably a Zero trying to intercept us. 8,000 feet. 6,000 feet. The carrier filled my entire forward view now. I could make out individual aircraft on her deck, Nakajima B-5 and Cape bombers loaded with 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs meant for our ships. Fuel hoses snaked across the flight deck. Aviation gasoline, bombs, and torpedoes, everything needed to turn a ship into a floating crematorium. 4,000 feet. I centered the carrier's island structure in my bomb sight and held it there. At this altitude, the anti-aircraft fire was so intense it looked like a black cloud, but there was no time to think about that now. 2,500 feet. Now, I pulled the bomb release handle and immediately hauled back on the stick, pulling out of the dive with enough G-force to gray out my vision. As the SBD leveled off at 1,500 feet, I looked back over my shoulder. My 1,000-pound bomb had hit Soryu's flight deck just aft of her island, right in the middle of her spotted aircraft. The explosion touched off the fuel and ordnance on deck, and secondary explosions began rippling across the ship. Within seconds, the entire forward half of her flight deck was a mass of flames. But I couldn't watch the show. Zeros were diving on us now, and I had to get my SBD the hell out of there. I pushed the throttle to the firewall and headed northeast, weaving frantically to avoid the Japanese fighters. Behind me, Soryu was dying. Lieutenant Commander Agusa's dive bomber section had also scored hits on the carrier, and she was burning from stem to stern. At 1913 hours that evening, racked by internal explosions, she would roll over and sink with most of her crew. But Soryu wasn't the only carrier hit during those miraculous 5 minutes. McCluskey's section had plastered Kaga with 4 direct hits, turning her into a floating inferno. Best had put his 1,000-pounder right into Akagi's flight deck, igniting her fuel and ammunition. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. Only Hiryu remained operational, and she was already launching a counterattack. The flight back to Enterprise was a nightmare of empty fuel tanks and pursuing Zeros. My fuel gauge was bumping empty, and Snowden was calling out Japanese fighters closing from astern. 2 Zeros made firing passes at us, their 20mm cannon shells sparking off the SBD's armored back plate. Snowden's twin. 30S chattered in reply, and I saw 1 Zero smoking as it pulled away. At 12:05 hours, I spotted the familiar outline of Enterprise on the horizon. Never had anything looked so beautiful, but our problems weren't over. Hiryu had launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, and they were inbound on our task force. I managed to land aboard Enterprise just as General Quarters sounded. Hiryu's strike was 15 minutes out. As plane handlers pushed my SBD forward to clear the landing area, I looked back at my aircraft. The fuselage was peppered with bullet holes, and one wing had a gash from a 20mm shell. But she'd brought us home. The Japanese attack hit at 12:05 hours. 18 RHED-3A Val dive bombers came screaming down on our formation, their fixed landing gear making them look like prehistoric birds of prey. Enterprise's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts, and our F4F Wildcats tore into the Japanese formation. But several Vals got through. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, causing significant damage and forcing her to reduce speed. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, and Spruance assumed tactical command of all 3 task forces. At 14:30 hours, Hiryu launched her second strike, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. These also found Yorktown, which was still struggling to repair damage from the first attack. 2 torpedoes slammed into her port side, causing severe flooding and a heavy list. At 1500 hours, Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship. But Hiryu's time was running out. At 15:30 hours, Enterprise launched 24 SBDs to finish off the last Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the strike, and I was part of it, my second mission of the day. We found Hiryu at 1700 hours, running northwest at high speed with her escorts. She was a beautiful ship, the newest and fastest of the Japanese carriers, but she was also the last. Gallagher let us down in a perfect textbook attack, and our bombs turned her flight deck into a blazing ruin. Like her three sister ships, Hiryu would burn through the night before sinking the next morning. The Battle of Midway was over, though none of us knew it at the time. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 600 miles to the west, had lost the heart of his carrier fleet. Without air cover, his invasion force was helpless. At 0255 hours on June 5th, he canceled Operation Me and ordered a general withdrawal. In 4 days of fighting, the Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 men. The American losses were 1 carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by a Japanese submarine on June 7th, 1 destroyer Hammond, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. But the numbers don't tell the real story. At Midway, Japan lost not just ships and planes, but something far more precious, her experienced naval aviators. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack on Hickam Field, went down with their ships. These men were irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers. In fact, they would build several during the war, but they could never replace the skilled aircrews who died in the Pacific that day. For America, Midway was vindication. After 6 months of defeats and retreats, we had finally met the Japanese fleet in open battle and won decisively. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. More importantly, we had stopped their advance across the Pacific. The Japanese would never again possess the strength to mount a major offensive operation. But victory came at a terrible price. Of the 42 aircraft in our 3 torpedo squadrons, only 4 returned to their carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8 was wiped out completely, 15 brave men who pressed home their attacks against impossible odds, knowing they were flying to their deaths. Their sacrifice drew down the Japanese combat air patrol and made our dive bomber attacks possible. I think about those torpedo bomber crews often, men like Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo 8's death ride against the Japanese fleet. His last radio transmission was, "Attack immediately." There were no dramatic speeches, no stirring words, just a simple command from a professional officer doing his job. In the years since Midway, historians have called it the turning point of the Pacific War, and they're right. But for those of us who were there, it didn't feel like a turning point. It felt like a miracle. Everything that could have gone right for us did. Our intelligence service broke the Japanese codes and gave us advance warning. Admiral Spruance made exactly the right decisions at exactly the right times. The Japanese made critical errors, changing course when they should have held steady, keeping their combat air patrol low when it should have been high, loading their flight decks with fuel and ordnance just as our dive bombers arrived. But mostly, Midway was won by ordinary American sailors, Marines, and airmen who did extraordinary things. Men like Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, who floated in his life raft for 30 hours while watching the battle rage around him. Men like aviation machinist mate First Class Bruno Guido, who manned his rear seat guns in a damaged TBD until he was forced to ditch, then was captured and murdered by the Japanese. Men like Major Lofton Henderson, the Marine Squadron commander, who led his obsolete dive bombers against the Japanese fleet and died in the attempt. They called us the greatest generation, but we didn't feel great. We felt scared, tired, and homesick. We did what we did because it was our job, because our country needed us, and because we couldn't let down the men fighting beside us. The SBD Dauntless was retired from frontline service in 1944, replaced by newer, faster aircraft. But for one shining moment over the Central Pacific, she was exactly the right airplane in exactly the right place. Ed Hindman's sturdy dive bomber, flown by young men barely out of their teens, had changed the course of history. I flew 58 combat missions during World War II and survived them all. Many of my friends did not. Every year on June 4th, I think about the boys who didn't come home, the torpedo bomber crews who gave their lives to set up our attack, the fighter pilots who held off the Zeros, the sailors who went down with Yorktown. They were the real heroes of Midway. As for me, I was just a farm boy from Kansas who learned to fly Navy airplanes. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the right training and the right aircraft, when history pivoted on the edge of 5 minutes. When people ask me what it felt like to help win the Battle of Midway, I tell them the truth. I was too busy trying to stay alive to feel much of anything. But looking back now, more than 80 years later, I understand what we accomplished in those waters northwest of Midway Atoll. We stopped the Japanese advance across the Pacific. We bought precious time for American industry to gear up for war. Most importantly, we proved that free men, fighting for their homes and families, could defeat any tyranny, no matter how powerful it seemed. The Japanese came to Midway with the finest naval force ever assembled. They left the ocean floor littered with the wreckage of their ambitions. In 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, a handful of American dive bombers changed the course of the Second World War. It was, as Admiral Nimitz said, our finest hour. But it was also our most costly, paid for with the lives of young men who deserved to see their grandchildren grow up. We won the Battle of Midway, but we must never forget the price of that victory or the courage of those who paid it. Lieutenant J.G. Norman Dusty Kleiss survived the war and went on to serve 28 years in the U.S. Navy. He was one of only 2 pilots to hit 2 different Japanese aircraft carriers on the same day during the Battle of Midway. He died in 2016 at the age of 100, one of the last surviving Midway veterans.